Well, greetings, everybody. This is Randy Welsh, the Executive Director for the National Wilderness Stewardship Alliance. And we're happy that you could join us today for our continuing webinar series on the Wilderness Stewardship Advocacy. Today, we're going to be looking at Wilderness Stewardship Advocacy 101, dealing with agency relations, and we're going to start introduction into congressional relations as well. With me, I have a whole host of experts in the field, people who have years of experience in doing wilderness stewardship advocacy. We're going to meet some of them here shortly, and then we're going to dive into our program. Let's see here. So with me today is Sue Spear, a retired Forest Service employee. And if you would wave to the audience when your name is called, that would be great. Sue is a past director for the Wilderness and Wild and Scenic Rivers program in the Washington office of the Forest Service. Also with us today, another retired Forest Service employee is Joe Redden. Joe worked in a variety of positions throughout the West and finished his career in Washington, D.C., working with legislative affairs and in the veg management shop. Among our steward advocates, Bill Hodge, many of you know, the executive director for the Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation, also has been past director for the Southern Appalachian Wilderness Stewards. From Washington, D.C., we have Anders Reynolds, an attorney with the Southern Environmental Law Center, lobbyist with the Southern Environmental Law Center, working intimately with the congressional offices and lots of depth of experience. He also did a stint as the board chair for the Southern Appalachian Wilderness Stewards, giving him a very in-depth knowledge of wilderness stewardship issues. Also with us is my board chair, Andrew Downs, who is the Appalachian Trail Conservancy Southern Regional Director. And joining us a little later here will be Brendan Misilik, who is a lobbyist with the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. Mark Larabee, who's been the media advisor, public affairs officer for the Pacific Crest Trail Association. And we're especially grateful to have John Pomeroz, an attorney in Washington, D.C., who's extensive experience both on the stewardship side and the lobbying side, going to give us the tips and techniques, the do's and the don'ts, and what we need to be worried about, not worried about when it comes to lobbying. And then, of course, myself, Randy Welsh, the Executive Director for the National Wilderness Stewardship Alliance. So we're glad that you could all join us here today. And our coverage today is going to cover a lot of topics. We've got a lot of speakers. Each of them are going to spend a little time talking about areas of specialty. We're going to dig first into kind of why we advocate, how we go about doing that with agencies, what kind of information you need to know about agencies, looking at their structure, their organization, and how you can best interact with them. Then we're going to switch into looking at some congressional advocacy, talk about their field offices, the DC offices, the difference between the two. Then we're going to discuss how you can interact with legislation and appropriations, kind of the two key points where stewardship advocacy is going to have an effect on could you, whoever's got their voice on, could they please mute, please? And then we're going to be talking about how you can utilize media for stewardship advocacy, and then a couple of polls, and we're going to end the call today, again, reviewing the rules and regs of advocacy, the issues with lobbying, and what that really means, and how we don't need to really worry about it too much. We're going to end with the final logistic details as we move through our webinar series and move towards our workshop in November. We'll make sure we provide plenty of time for questions and answers as well. All right, so as we begin, we just want to, again, wilderness stewardship advocacy as a definition is sharing information about the places we love with the people who can make a difference, with a specific intention to make improvements in how they are managed. And we're usually dealing with Congress, agencies, and the public. So today our focus is going to be on agencies and a little bit on Congress. So I'm going to stop and turn the time over to Sue and Sue Spear.
Okay.
And I will put your slide back up again, Sue.
Okay, good. Well, good afternoon and good morning, depending upon where you are. I'm very pleased to be joining you today. And I'm going to talk about the Forest Service organization and a little bit about roles and how you can interact with those different levels of the agency. And I wanted to, let's see, I'll start with a point that took me a while to figure out, I will say, even in my job, is that this is clearly the Forest Service organization. If you also work with the Park Service of the BLM or the Fish and Wildlife Service, they're different. And I never did figure it out after almost 5 years as a director. They're all very different organizations. So this is just the Forest Service. And we, of course, the Forest Service is a hierarchical organization. I'm sure you've heard that phrase before. There are 4 different levels within the organization. And there's the headquarters, the Washington office that you see here. And then there's the regional offices, the national forests, and lastly, the districts. Of course, those are located all over the country. And you probably work with multiple levels of the agency. So I'm going to focus on the Washington office, and the main function and role of the Washington office is to set and manage national policy, to distribute appropriated funds, and to maintain relationships for the agency within Washington. That's with the Department of Agriculture, in which it sits, and other federal agencies such as the DOI agencies and OMB, and of course, Congress. Very important role for the Washington office. Now, the Forest Service has a chief and staff organization within headquarters. You can see there's the chief at the top with several boxes underneath, which are staff reporting to the chief's office directly. And you see legislative affairs there. And Joe Redden, who's speaking next, is going to talk a little bit about that group. And then you see there's 5 different direct reports in the blue boxes. Those are deputy chiefs and the chief financial officer, all reporting to the chief. And look to the left of the screen and you'll find the National Forest System. And that's primarily who I'll be talking about. Let's look at the next slide, Randy. So here you see the directors, the directorships that under the deputy chiefs. You'll see 2 associate deputy chiefs, and those are also key roles for you to know of. And then below that, you'll see the director positions, the directorships, and there you see, you'll find, well, under NFS, there is just circled wilderness and wild and scenic rivers. And below that, also very important, is recreation, heritage, and volunteer resources. And that's the program that has the trails program. So there's 2 different staffs, 2 different directors, at least for now. That may change in the future, but it's very important for you to know that there are 2 different directors and staff groups for those 2 programs. You'll need to work with both if you work in, depending upon which program you're working in. And then let's look at the last slide, Randy. As you can see, this was a giant chart. So Randy broke it up nicely into 3 different pieces. So here you see the regional offices are 1 through 10, again, under National Forest System. Those are the regions. Now, another sort of key point here is that the regional foresters report directly to the chief. They do not report to the deputy chief for NFS. So that's a key relationship for you to know. The deputy chief and his staff represent staff to the chief. The regional foresters have their own set of directors and staff, and they all report, Forest Service staff report to the line officer that leads the office in which they are organized to. That's kind of another key function to understand. Now, let's see, Randy, let's go back up one chart to see so you can see the deputy chiefs. So I mentioned it's important to know the Wilderness and Wild and Scenic Rivers and the Recreation Heritage Volunteer Resources directorships, and they report to the two associate deputy chiefs and deputy chief of the National Forest System. And it's appropriate, and I think Randy shared with me that when you all go into Washington to meet as a group, a big group of all of your organizations, then the directors and the deputy chief of National Forest System is trying to schedule that meeting for you with the chief. And that is generally how it works. Probably what happened is Randy gave a phone call to the acting director of Wilderness or Recreation, and they talked to the associate deputy chief, who then talked to the deputy chief and got the okay to then go talk to the chief's office to get on the schedule. So I want you to understand that each of those players is a part of the conversation in setting up your meeting, and maybe even meeting with you separately before you meet with the chief. And I want one thing I think is important for you to know, sort of what the chief and the deputy chief, the directors, consider partners groups. You know, you are key partners, players for the agency, because you are helping us accomplish our programs and delivering our priorities for public services. So that's important for you then, when you meet with these folks, to share how you're doing that, what you're doing to meet agency programs and agency priorities. So you've probably already understood that the deputy chief and the chief have very high demands for their time. So when you get the opportunity to meet with them, you want to be very concise in your presentation. You want to share written materials ahead of time. I know that Randy makes sure you all do that very well. You want to share your performance statistics, any matching funds that you have generated, and the number of public members or volunteers that you've engaged and worked with. Those are very important things for the agency to understand what you are bringing to the partnership. When you meet with them, with the leadership, of course, you want to be very respectful. I would suggest saying thank you if you've received funds. They always like to hear thank you. And make sure that you are, positive, of course, and really genuine. I know none of you have any trouble doing all of that. I just mention it because sometimes you get a little, nervous meeting with these folks. One of the things that I will suggest also, be prepared to share, to ask or answer questions. So certainly the deputy chief and the new chief, Randy Moore, are both really good at asking questions, and usually they're really hard. So be prepared. Maybe be able, they might ask you, well, what are your challenges? How's it going? Your meeting with them is a chance for them to find out how things are going in the field, on the ground, which they don't get to go visit very often. So your coming into Washington is really very helpful to them, but so be prepared to answer some of those questions. Now let me talk a little bit about timing of budget and money. And as you may know, the president's budget annually is submitted to Congress. It's supposed to be the 1st of February every year. And so you back up months from that because the agencies are all preparing that budget proposal for almost a year beforehand. So if that's in February, I can tell you it's the spring before when that deputy chief and then the chief's office is deciding whether or not they're going to fund priority projects. And priority projects are the Trails Stewardship Program, the Wilderness Stewardship Program, those funding programs that go out to the field. So that those decisions are made in the spring. And then another key point is in the fall. That is when the agency is very quickly gathering performance data. So I know Randy puts all of that stuff together that you guys do over the summer season. And that material is then included, those performance data is included in the president's budget that gets submitted to Congress that next February. And I know Randy keeps track very closely of all those deadlines, and he makes sure you all get that information if you are applying for those programs for funding. Okay, now I want to talk just a little bit about the regions. So thanks for having that slide up, Randy. The key relationship, there is a key relationship, of course, between the regional office staff and the Washington office staff. Those directors work together, the staff works very closely together. And so it's important for you all to be working with the staff all the way up and down the agency, obviously starting at the bottom and then moving up to the regions. And then even to the Washington office, you may work directly with those staff. Now, I want to mention one other way that you can reach out and communicate with a deputy chief or the chief of the agency. And of course, you can make a direct phone call to those offices. Those are known phone numbers. But especially, I know if you were to call the chief's office, if they don't know you, if it's like a cold call, what you might think of as a cold call, then you're probably not going to get through to the chief. And what will happen is that his executive assistant will talk to a deputy chief and then on down the organization until they find information about who you are and what you might want to talk about. And depending upon what that is, then they'll decide who will respond to you or who will call you back. And so once you've established a relationship, that's very different. And of course, then you can do the direct phone calls and probably your call will go through. Otherwise, I just wanted you to be aware, if it takes a few days for somebody to get back to you after you've called the chief's office, that's probably why. And so I am going to leave it there, and I'm certainly planning to stay on. If I can answer any questions that come up later, I'm happy to. So thanks very much.
All right, thanks, Sue. We will get back to we will get back to you here in a minute. I'm going to turn the time over to Bill Hodge, who's going to kind of fill in from a stewardship person's perspective, the working with the agency from top to bottom.
Thanks, Randy.
So Bill.
Hey, everybody. Hey, everybody. And such an honor to follow Sue. Sue and I had at least from my perspective, the great pleasure of getting to work very closely together for her years when she was the director for wilderness response in New Rivers, and certainly an honor to get to follow her and fill in a little bit on our side about what those sort of relationships look like. The place I want to start is with a line that I use a lot, which is go local, go often. It is very important. We're trying to grow a cadre of stewardship organizations who are willing to show up in DC and be advocates for the program that we all work within as partners. But there's no showing up in DC or showing up in a regional office if you're not engaged in a very in-depth and productive relationship on a local level. And that should include knowing the staff very well and knowing the district ranger very well. I can't emphasize enough, and this is sort of basically human dynamics 101, but the relationship should be real. It should be genuine, and you should show a real and genuine interest in subjects that go beyond maybe your world. If you're focused on trails, you should still show an interest in what might be the challenges of the day that they're facing in other areas. Obviously, particularly out west here right now, they're all stressed. The entire agency is stressed to the max with what's going on with our sort of unprecedented fire season. So don't just show up, want to talk about your issue and go away. You should be genuinely interested in what their challenges are, what their priorities are, and where those intersect with your goals and your objectives. Work hard to facilitate a real shoulder to shoulder, and what I like to refer to as a working with, not on relationship with the agency. It's very easy to just show up and think that your role as a partner is to just show up and work on National Forest Service designated wilderness lands, and not thinking about it from the perspective of that you actually work with the agency. You just don't show up to work on Forest Service lands, and that you work in a shoulder to shoulder fashion. I think that becomes really important when we start thinking about becoming advocates. If they know you as somebody who is willing to have ongoing dialogue with them about what you see the challenges are, what they see the challenges are, where the intersections are, how you work together to sustain the wilderness resource, then when you have a moment in which you maybe want to advocate for something, it's never going to catch them by surprise, because they're going to know what your view is on things. Whether, an example I would give here is there's an interest in planting nursery stock, white bark pine nursery stock, that is blister rust resistant. And there's a very deep interest in planting that in wilderness. Nobody in the agency will be surprised that I am very uncomfortable with that trammeling action in wilderness. And they wouldn't be. And they're not going to be offended that I maybe disagree with the decision may come, because they know through our relationship where I stand on that. And as with all relationships, you should always be open and honest with those district level relationships. And one of the strongest opportunities you're going to have to deepen and strengthen those relationships is when you or the relationship takes a stumble. Never look at that as a reason to run and hide. It should be as a reason to engage on, okay, where did I go wrong? Where did the relationship go wrong? How do we learn from that? Some of the strongest relationships I have maybe didn't begin with a misstep, but they survived a misstep because we had a chance to work through it together. Again, no surprises, and be willing to own when things haven't gone the way you expected to, so that you establish that relationship. When you go to step up that reach, when you try to move beyond your working relationship on the ground with the district and the district staff, you should absolutely be engaged with forest supervisors and at the forest level, including with their staff. And I think it's an incredibly important relationship for you to have. They should be involved in understanding not just how you work. And Sue made a great point of showing up with statistics. If you're in Washington, showing up with the whole community's done, but in your local case, you should be showing up with what you've done, but also, most importantly, that forest supervisor should have an idea why you do the work that you do, and why you're interested in the wilderness resource, and why you should be involved in a relationship with them in terms of having a shared understanding of the relationship. The last thing, though, that you ever want to try to engage the forest supervisor on, in my opinion, is to mediate a disagreement you maybe have at a district level. Work things out with your district ranger, with your district staff. It should be a pretty extraordinary circumstance if you're going to turn to a forest supervisor, try to mediate a conflict that you can't work through. And very rarely have I ever had an issue that had to be resolved at any higher level. So I think it's pretty important to have that relationship, that they know who you are, that they know why you're there. And as with all of these levels that you step up, back to my line about there should never be any surprises. You going and building that relationship with the forest supervisor or the forest level staff should not be a surprise to the district level staff that you work at. It should never be seen as a go around. They should know that you're going, and they should have a really good idea about what that lunch you're going to have with the forest supervisor is going to be about and what you plan to talk about. Because often you're going to be advocating for things that the district staff is interested in you in advocating for. So these aren't separate relationships. These are built upon relationships. When it comes to the higher levels in Sue's org chart, the working with regional offices, regional foresters, regional staff, and the WO, never assume that your advocacy is not worthy of those offices. Sue's right. People often get in the Yates building or get in the regional office and get nervous and get intimidated. I encourage you to not allow yourself to be intimidated by the position. That doesn't mean not respect the position, but they're humans too. And if you come in with a respectful dialogue, there's no reason to be nervous. In my mind, these conversations with the regional staff and the regional foresters, and I do believe you should have a relationship with the regional foresters. I don't care if you only work in one wilderness or you work in 70 wildernesses across the entire region. I think it's important to have a relationship with the regional forester. It's again another place to advocate for why you're showing up to do the work that you're doing and why it's important for the district staff. But these shouldn't be down in the weeds discussions about what's going on unless there's an accumulation of things going on that you want them to be aware of, that you're seeing, let's say, similar decisions that you're concerned about being made for the wilderness resource that you just want to voice. And again, the forest and the district staff should not be surprised that you're having that conversation with regional staff and with the regional forester. Lastly, I would say be seen and be an advocate for the agency. Don't just be an advocate for wilderness. Be an advocate for those people you work with day in and day out. I would say 85 to 90% of the advocacy work that I've done over the last decade plus has been advocating for the agency itself. And sometimes that means advocating for the agency staff you work with on a local district or forest or regional level within the staff in the Washington office. But know what is impacting the overall wilderness community. Don't show up in DC with your specific message for your specific wilderness that you're dealing with. Know what everybody else is there advocating for. And that's the great role that Randy and NWSA play for all of us, is sort of condensing all of those common issues. But again, the last thing I'm going to emphasize one more time is no one should be surprised by the meetings you're having and what the topics are that you're going to discuss. Every time I went to DC and met with the chief, or more importantly, my frequent meetings with the deputy chief, Chris French, Sue not only knew I was coming, Sue was in those meetings with me, and we sort of almost mutually set up those conversations. She would know what was on the agenda. Of course, they were free-form conversations, and Chris would have questions that would send us in new directions, but there was an idea of the message we wanted to convey. So again, go local, go often, never surprise anybody with the messages you're taking on up the chain, and build strong, deep relationships. So thanks.
All right, thank you, Bill. So our audience, as you're hearing this, you can be thinking about your questions. So go ahead and type them in to the chat, and we will be collecting those and capturing them for sharing later. Well, let's go into our next segment, where Joe Redden is going to talk about wilderness legislative affairs.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Randy. It's going to be a tough act to follow Bill and Sue. But I was a legislative affairs specialist for the Forest Service at one time in my career, and spent about 8 years in the legislative affairs program area. And at various times, our director would allow people to mix and match their portfolios. And I took on the wilderness portfolio for several years. And so what I heard from previous presenters, Sue and Bill, it's all about relationships. And it is all about relationships. But the legislative affairs relationship is more focused on the relationship with the House and the Senate, as it is opposed to, wilderness advocacy groups. So in my experience as a legislative affairs specialist, we usually had notification that a wilderness bill was introduced in the House or the Senate, and then that it made it onto the schedule, and it was to have a hearing in front of either the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee or the House Natural Resources Committee. That's when myself, I would engage then with my regional counterpart, which is the regional legislative affairs specialist, and then they would engage in your colleagues, like the wilderness program manager for the region, the director of wilderness recreation and heritage for that region. And that's why it's important to have those relationships there, because this is where legislative affairs gets its information from the line officer on the forest. Again, both the district ranger and the forest supervisor, very, very important relationships, because what has happened is that you as an advocate in your organization have gotten a member and a member staff that represents that particular area to introduce this bill. Some states, those members are actually out of state. So you have to know in the House and the Senate, out of the 535 members, who might be a very staunch advocate for wilderness, but not actually have any federal land in their district. And a name that comes to mind is the former New York Congressman Maurice Henshey, who represented Middle New York State and was a very, very strong advocate for wilderness preservation, both in all of the federal land management system agencies. So, the legislation, as it comes in, I work then to try and understand where this wilderness will be, what parameters it will have. And there's various versions of wilderness bills. Some of them allow water development, some of them don't. In the West, there's always a grandfathering in of livestock grazing, for example. There are complexities that go along with this. And one of the things that I learned is about federal power withdrawals in particular areas, particularly on wild and scenic river corridors, but they can still be in some wildernesses if there's a joint wilderness and a wild and scenic river bill running at the same time, if that legislation includes both of those statutes. And then mineral deposits and title claims and all of that stuff can be very tricky. So what we do to try and have a clean wilderness bill at the legislative affairs end of things is we'll work with the minerals and geology management staff to figure out how valid these claims are. And you've seen the legislation. It will say subject to valid existing claims, and there's a possibility, slight as it may be, that somebody could actually mine in a wilderness if their claim was determined or deemed to be valid. But I'm not aware of any that have happened, but I could be wrong on that. But then the next step is preparing testimony. And how I prepare that testimony is, well, we decide, do we support this bill or do we not? And a lot of times on the wilderness bills, we look to go out of our way to make a recommendation of support for the legislation, because we know that there's been conversations with the forest supervisor, with the regional forester. They have signaled to the national office that they would support such a thing. The delegation from the state would support it. So we look to make that actually happen. When we write our testimony, when we make the recommendation though for support, it's actually the Office management and budget work, which works for the president, that actually concurs with our recommendation of support, or they will tell us that they're opposed to it, and we have no choice but to be opposed to it. But the testimony as drafted by the agency, by legislative affairs staff, gets reviewed by national staff and sometimes regional staff. And then on special occasions, even the forest supervisor will take a look at the testimony. And then it goes to the department. From the Department of Agriculture, it goes to OMB, and it goes around the larger federal government. And there's many edits, and usually the testimony is not finalized until the 11th hour and 59th minute, right before the hearing. And so there was a lot of late nights that you work and then send it over to the member who is the sponsor. We send it over to their staff, and then that they send it to the committee, and majority and minority get the same copy of the testimony, so they have it. And then, you know, in better times, it would be good, because you will know as an advocate, you will be informed by your local Forest Service office when the hearing is going to be, and if you can make it to that hearing, you know, at the House or in the Senate, it's good to be there. And then there's always an informal time that you can talk to the agency witness, if you can, you know, say a few words of encouragement to the agent. That would be like an associate deputy chief, deputy chief, or the chief. Those are usually our witnesses. But and then, you know, there are members, and if you know the member from your district that's on that committee, it's always good to make that face contact before or after the hearing, let them know that you were there in support of that legislation. So that's on the influence part of putting together a bill that would be passed by both the House and Senate and then enacted by the president. So fairly quick summary of how things go. And I will be staying online to answer questions.
All right, thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Randy.
Thank you, Joe. So let's move into some of the other pieces of congressional advocacy. Andrew, we're going to start with you. So we're going to start at the bottom of the congressional staff, working with the field offices.
Yeah, thanks, Randy, and hi, everyone. I'm Andrew Downs. I work for the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, and a couple points I want to make about working with field offices for congressional staff kind of mirror in some ways the things that Bill spoke about when working with districts and local Forest Service representatives. I think one of the most important things to understand about working with local field offices is that these are people from your community. So they're going to know some of the same people, some of the same organizations, and really exist as part of your community network, whether you've been introduced to them before or not. So I think making sure that you have a clear and open line of communication that's not really associated with any particular legislation or particular ask is really an important key for them to know you, your organization, what kind of standards and expectations and operations you have just as a normal day-to-day work that you do stewarding wilderness. I think after that, when you start looking at advocating for particular legislation or awareness or what have you, they're going to, if you build those relationships well, they're going to know or at least understand when you present issues or opportunities to them as well. So it'll be, you're creating context for a lot of this relationship work. I think making sure that that they know when you might be going or either to DC to visit with a member or asking a a member's office in DC for a meeting, make sure that the field office that is really commonly a primary point of contact for organizations, doing this type of work, making sure they know your plans, I think is important, because if a DC office gets a request from you and they say, oh, we're supposed to meet with this guy, Andrew, he's from down your way, works on the Appalachian Trail. Do you know what he might want to talk about? And they say no. Boy, you've missed a real opportunity to have somebody that you've built a relationship with, give some background about how you're an accountable partner, a pleasure to be around, et cetera, et cetera. So understanding that how a field office works in relationship to the DC office is important. I think also making sure, going back to that point I made earlier about understanding that these field office reps and are members of your community is an important one. You can pop your head in, you can schedule meetings one-on-one, but if you're doing any events, if you're doing any partnership development that doesn't directly involve the congressional office, I think extending invitations so they can get out and the staffers can get out and see your organization working, building partnerships, working with agencies. All that stuff is really important because these field reps or these field offices for the congressional staff, they're doing this as a public service, so they really want to get out there, understand what's going on in their community, be part of it. And I think those are key ways that you can build long-lasting relationships with these representatives, is treating them like the human beings that they are in the communities that you also live in. So that's a really important, I think, foundational perspective to carry into building relationships with these field offices. I think that, one other point that I'd like to make is when you are working with these folks, I wouldn't assume that they have an accurate information about who you are and what you do. So you always kind of want to be reminding them, teaching them a little bit about your work and why it's important, and taking every opportunity you can to kind of draw bright lines around your mission-based work so they kind of know what you do and what you don't do, because you really want these folks to be really informed about the service you are providing to Wilderness, because that way, if something pops up on a committee meeting or an issue pops up in DC and they call down to the field office, do we know anybody doing X, Y, or Z? Well, they'll have accurate information about your organization and be able to either put you on that list of people that we might need to talk about or talk to, or also important, make sure you're not on any inappropriate lists so they don't waste their time and yours. So making sure they have good information about who you are and what you do is really important. Making sure that you include them not only for these asks and issue-based work, but also just in general partnership development, events, meetings, all that stuff that they may glean or provide information on a congressional representative's perspective. It's always a great invite. But these are offices where I think if you're going to go forward with the advocacy strategy, you really want to be a known quantity in there, so you can answer questions and work together collaboratively wherever the opportunities arise. Randy, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, we're going to pause for just a second. You can take a break from your multitasking or wake up from the webinar. What I'd like to do is to ask you a poll question. How many of you have visited a congressional office, either in DC, in a field, or both, or never visited? And let's just get a sense for our audience here as to how many have actually engaged with a member of Congress or their staff. go ahead and take that poll. There's a couple more of you that need to do it. Well, I think we're getting pretty stabilized. It looks like, you know, there's a few of you that have been to DC to a congressional office. Not very many people have been to a field office though. And some have never been. So we're hoping that through this presentation that you'll feel more comfortable attending going and visiting with a congressional member and sharing the good work that you're doing in stewardship and wilderness. So I just wanted to add a couple of other things about congressional field offices. It depends on the state, but most congressmen and senators have 3 to 5 field offices scattered throughout their state. More for the bigger states, maybe a few lesser if they're condensed or in urban areas. Often some of the field staff are single person offices, and they deal with everything and anything that the congressman is dealing with across the whole extent of government. So their interest or their knowledge of natural resources and you know, the particular agency, the Forest Service, might be limited. And so this becomes a great opportunity for you to help share and educate them about the work that you're doing and the opportunities for the member to be involved. State offices for congressionals usually have a few more staff, and there may even be a legislative person, a legislative aide or a legislative director that helps that congressional member manage the legislation workload. And those are the people that you want to make sure that you know and or have an opportunity to visit with, so that when a particular piece of legislation comes that you're interested in, you'll know who to talk to. Most of these staffers are meeting with constituents, they're troubleshooting issues. There's a lot of veterans, Medicare claims, any sort of interaction with the federal government. These staffers are their main work is to help troubleshoot constituent issues with those agencies. And they are the eyes and the ears for the member. Now, you know, in a district where there is a lot of natural resource issues, somebody will be designated as a lead for those issues, and they'll be tasked to go out to public meetings to address specific project issues and other major concerns that are happening where there is a lot of agency meetings on a particular topic. These are the folks that you're going to want to get to meet. So when you can go visit them in their offices, you can go visit them while they're in their meetings. But the one thing I wanted to really stress is that these folks like to get out in the field. They're usually chained to their desks in the office. Anytime you can offer them an opportunity for a field trip to see firsthand work that's being done on the national forest or on other agency lands, they are usually willing to jump at that opportunity. And I think it's a great way to build relationships. It's a great way to give them a better insight, your perspective on the issue, and be able to provide that level of education that they just might not have because of all the other pressures that they have in their jobs. Again, these field staff folks are the conduit for you to get information passed up to the members in Washington, to share your concerns, to pass on any legislation that you're interested in and your thoughts about that legislation. So it behooves you to get to know the people that are in your local field offices and to invite them out and participate in the work that you're doing. All right, so let's turn now to Washington, D.C. and some of our experts there. So Anders is going to spend a little time talking about our Washington, D.C. interaction on legislation from the stewardship organization side.
I am. By my count, we're running a little bit behind, so I'm going to try to talk super fast here because I know there's some interesting stuff from John coming up about advocacy, and I also want Brendan to take us through a very important appropriations process. And in terms of best practices for
Anders, we're doing okay on time. This is a 2-hour
okay,
webinar.
good to know.
We've got
Okay.
plenty of time.
And in terms of best practices for congressional advocacy, a lot of it overlaps with what you've heard from Sue and Bill and Andrew and others. So, you know, I think everything's been said, just not everybody said it yet. But I want to break things down into two different groups, and that's preparation and execution. And tackling preparation first, there was something that I was saying at the end of our very first call that I wanted to revisit today. And that is there are 435 members of the House and 100 senators. So that's 535 decision makers on the Hill. And your job is to find out what kind of small business they are. And I'm putting small business in quotes. I like to think of them each as a small business. Are they run very well? Are they run very poorly? Are they run somewhere in the middle? Do they have a strong boss, meaning the member of Congress is making all the decisions? Or is the staff really the one that is most competently keeping this ship going straight? Do they have a good staff? Do they listen to their trade union? And by trade union, I mean, are they reliant on their caucus to make decisions? Or do they sort of go out on their own? Are they strongly and fiercely independent? There are a lot of different ways that small businesses that we all frequent are run. There are a lot of different ways that a small business can succeed. And congressional offices work the same way. And so it's your job to figure out what kind of small business you're going to be dealing with. And you can do that by visiting with people who have met with them before. You can do that just by an exploratory meeting that asks questions. But it really behooves you and it falls on you to figure out what sort of office you'll be meeting with and who the decision makers are. My second piece of advice for preparation is to keep in mind that this member, at the very least, views themselves as an expert on their district. Now, in reality, you might be the expert on your district. You may know more than they do, but you're going to have to keep that to yourself because in their mind, they know more than anybody else about their district. And they've got some evidence to back that up because every other year, at least, they win an election. So they're not wrong that they're extremely popular. And so for better or worse, the way they sort of think about their job is that they know best, or at least they know the people that know best. And so with that in mind, my third piece of advice is to associate your cause with the election winner's cause. Now, I'm not going to go so far as to say you need to associate your cause with their reelection. I think that would be really troublesome, really problematic. But what you need to think about is when they think about the reasons that they succeed, is it because they're committed to jobs? Is it because they're committed to clean water? Is it because they're committed to outdoor recreation? Is it because of some other factor? And once you can figure out why they think that they know what they do and why they win the races they do, you can work to best associate what you want to do with those topics. And my fourth piece of advice for preparation is to listen and listen again, and to listen, to listen, to listen, and to listen. And listening is not passive. It also means to ask questions. When you reach out to people who have met with this office before and they tell you what kind of office it is, believe what they say, but also say, well, why is that? What's your experience? Dig deeper. When you're talking to actual staff, and we'll get to this in a minute, ask them why they made the decision they made or why their boss listens to the constituency that they do. There's no shame in asking, well, why? Why is that so important to them? You can do it in a way that doesn't seem aggressive, but rather seems curious. Which brings us to the second half of what I wanted to talk about, which is the execution. I was raised in a Judeo-Christian background, and the Beatitudes from Jesus's Sermon on the Mount were something I had to memorize growing up. And I'm sure you've all heard those. Blessed are the X, blessed are the Y. Well, there's a separate set of Beatitudes for the Hill. There's 8. Just like there were in the Sermon on the Mount. And I'm going to give you those 8 right now. The first is to be ready. You need to think of every possible scenario that you might get in this meeting on the Hill. You might hear a yes right off the bat. And if so, what's your next step? You may hear a no. And if so, what question do you ask? You may hear a, we need more information. How are you going to get them more information? Whatever path they choose, you need to be ready. Secondly, you need to be aware of your size. If, let's say, for example, a large California delegation is going around and meeting with every representative in California, if you're taking in 20 to 30 people, not everybody has to say anything. In fact, many of you don't need to say anything. The most extremely local people and the people who are the most knowledgeable should probably say something, or if there's someone with a personal connection to the member or the staffer. But please be aware that you don't have to go around the room and have everybody say everything they're thinking. The third is to be political. And this doesn't mean be partisan. It just means be political. These are political animals. They're thinking about re-election. They're thinking about how they interact with other people on the Hill. They're thinking about other projects they may have going on with the Forest Service or DOI or whoever. So bear in mind that just because you're asking them to do something, even if they want to do it, there may be some political restraint they're facing. And the more aware you are of that, the more savvy you are of that, the more open they can be with you about those hurdles. Fourth is to be pithy. You should say your piece. You should put it in a really understandable way, and you should get out of the way of the work. Fifth, be curious. I mentioned this before, but as they throw up roadblocks or mention constituencies that might disagree with you, ask questions. You know, well, why have you heard this? Where have you heard this? Who's telling you this? There's also positive questions. And Andrew mentioned this earlier. You could ask questions like, do you want to come see this for yourself? Does your staff want to? We would love to show you this. Are you curious about how it works? When will you be in the district? When can we have you meet with whoever? A good example of this that Bill Hodge accomplished, I know, is meeting with Mr. Phil Rowe, who was chairman of Veterans Affairs. And though Rowe had an ostensible interest in wilderness, what really got him hooked was hearing that there were a group of naval midshipmen coming down. And Bill's first question was, when do you want to meet them? When do you want to get out in the wilderness with them? And it worked because Bill was curious. Next is to be responsive. It's always best to go in so prepared that you have the answers for everything, but in reality, you're not going to have the answers for everything. And if you don't, you shouldn't lie. You shouldn't say, oh, it's this. Just say, I don't know, and I will get back to you. And sometimes it's even best to do that because it means you're going to get a second touch. I oftentimes don't answer the last question they ask on purpose so that I've got a reason to email them later. But regardless, even if you're doing that, remember that you have to be responsive. If they ask a question, they want to know the answer, whether that day or in the following days. So make sure you follow up. Second to last is to be memorable. Always come up with a way that you interact with them so that they remember the interaction positively, whether it's a story or a connection or whatever. Just make sure that when you leave, they're saying to their staff or the staff is saying to their boss, this is a good group. You got to hear about this meeting. I want you to hear what happened. And then finally, and I think Joseph talked about this earlier, be grateful. Start the meeting with a thank you. Figure out a way to thank them for something and end the meeting with a thank you. And the one at the end can be thanks for your time. But always be grateful. Make them believe that they're in the position to help you and that they can make a big difference with what you're asking. And I think I'll shut up now and pass it to Brendan. But I'll be around too to answer questions.
All right, thanks, Andrew. So Brendan, let's have you add to the conversation. And Brendan is with the ATC, working directly with members on the Hill.
Thanks, Randy. Yeah, I would like to recognize before I start speaking that there is so much good information coming through this webinar right now, but there is so much information coming through this webinar. So I think that I've been tapped to talk about something that is just a little more obscure, but I think is very important in understanding how to pull levers to advance policy. So there are, generally speaking, two kinds of laws that Congress is empowered to pass and bring to the president's desk for enactment. There are authorizations, such as the '66 Wilderness Act, that says there shall be these kinds of lands, they shall be managed in this way, they shall be subject to such restrictions, withholding, of course, the little tweaks that are made from bill to bill designating wilderness. So that's an authorization. Then there's what's called an appropriation, which is once a year, give or take, Congress will pass a law that says we are sending this much money to an agency to do thus and such thing that has been authorized via prior law. So there are multiple authorizing committees, and we talk about energy and natural resources in the Senate and the Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry. There's also the House Committee on Agriculture, or the House Committee on Natural Resources. There's only one Appropriations Committee per chamber, although the Appropriations Committees have subcommittees that reflect the rest of the chamber. But without getting into too much specifics on who sits on which committee and which committee is responsible for what and when, which is something that I love talking about, but I know that is something that is kind of a bore unless you really need to do something with that knowledge. It's important to understand that Congress and the federal government really is structured under the Constitution with a grant of powers. That it's the Constitution sort of sets up this government that is based on the consent of the people and the states, and everything not explicitly granted to the federal government in the Constitution is reserved to the states and to the people. And so Congress has to look to the Constitution when it passes laws. And it says, pursuant to this part of the Constitution, we're going to legislate on this kind of topic. So in a government of reserved powers, which is what the federal government is supposed to be, you have to have explicit authorization to do something in the federal government. Otherwise, you're always on kind of iffy ground. And you may be on iffy ground even if it is specifically tied to the Constitution, because a court could say, well, you can't do that because that's not what that means. And then you have a different kind of argument. But appropriations are what allow authorizations to actually function. Because, for instance, Congress could pass a law that says there shall be wilderness areas managed in such a fashion. But if it requires money for the agencies to actually do what Congress has said the agencies or folks in this alliance need to do to follow that law is probably not going to be followed. And there are plenty of things that are authorized by the federal government, by the Congress, that never get attention through appropriations and therefore never actually happen.
Did we lose Brendan?
I think we might have lost him. So let's see, I'm sure he'll call back in a second. But while we're waiting for Brendan to make it back, I just want you to notice this picture from a congressional office. Note that these are staffers working for Kevin McCarthy. They are all on the younger side. And you're going to find that the folks that work in Washington, D.C. typically are on the younger side, generally in their 20s. And so you need to factor that in too, in terms of how you relate and interact with some of the staffers. It's not until you reach some of the senior staff that you get folks that may have some experience, some age to them. And you'll find in the field staffs generally are a mix of both young and old. While we're waiting for Brendan to come back, let's move to the next topic.
I'm here. I'm here.
You
I'm
are
sorry.
here. Okay.
Yeah, I'm at my parents' house, and it is not exactly built for this. So hopefully
we're still losing you, Brendan. Your connection is not
I'm back
strong.
I'm back in this recording. I can't change that. So I can keep going, or we can move along, Randy. That's up to you.
I think you're cutting in and out, Brendan. So I'm unfortunately, I think we'll continue on with the presentation and move to Mark Larabee, and maybe we can, if that's all right, we'll move on to Mark.
Okay. You know.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Randy. Sorry, Brendan. My name is Mark Larabee. I'm the Advocacy Director for the Pacific Crest Trail Association. And in my former life, I spent 25 years as a newspaper reporter. So I'm here to talk about media. Brendan had a very wise word, which was pulling the levers of influence. One way to influence policy through Congress or land managers is through the media. If you're having trouble getting traction, getting your story out there may make a difference, because media attention could be the leverage you need to favorably move the needle. The reason is that public opinion can and often does shape policy, or at least spurs action by those who they might be concerned about voters, or they may be concerned about their bosses and the attention and issues being given. So those things can put pressure, and that may sound a little ugly, but that's the reality of the world we live in. The media is clearly interested in the work we're doing. They're interested in our public lands. Recent examples are the fight over the Bears Ears National Monument, the debate over ending the roadless rule to log the Tongass National Forest up in Alaska, and this vast and ongoing coverage we're seeing over Western wildfires and how they relate to climate change. We're all living through that. So the media is all over this stuff. And a story about your specific issue in the press has the added benefit of getting your message out to regular people, a wider audience, beyond your base supporters. So this can help you not only deal with the issue you're trying to deal with, but it can help you build longer term support for your ongoing work, because you're reaching new audiences. So as you're thinking about this, maybe engaging with a reporter, try to frame your issue so that it has the broadest appeal, and then try to get your local media involved, or your regional media, or even national media interest, if that's the route you think you need to go. You can do this in several ways. You can write your own opinion pieces and try to get them published. I've had great success getting published in medias in newspapers in the West on their opinion pages. I write a piece, I put my title, and they may invite a counterpoint to write, which is great for the debate. You can also write a letter to the editor that might be reacting to something you saw on their pages, and they're willing to publish those. Those are much shorter. Corporate blogs, you might have corporate partners that would allow you to tell your story. Many gear companies that we work with as our partners or our sponsors, they care for these wild spaces, and they're looking for ways to show their customers their concerns, and they'll give you space to do that. But really what we're talking about is trying to engage a reporter to write a story or do a TV spot or a radio spot about your cause. That's a little bit more complicated. Getting a reporter interested is probably the most difficult way to get media coverage, but it might be the most effective because it lends credibility to your issue. It's considered news. It's not an opinion. Well, of course he believes that because he works for them. Well, if a reporter's writing a story it may have this impression that it's got a bit more, it's a bit more important because it's supposed to be something that they're looking at without a lens. You know, they're trying to tell both sides of the story, and that reaches again the wide audience. So how do you do that? It's be helpful to build relationships with reporters before you need them. You know, and that can come to you. It's not always going to be your idea to publicize an issue. The reporter may be calling you because they've heard about something that puts you in a spot at times. Do not be afraid. Don't blow off their calls because they're giving you an opportunity to tell your side of the story. It might not be the only side of the story they tell. It most likely won't be. But if you don't say anything, then your side of the story isn't being told, and it's going to skew public opinion in the direction you don't want it to go. They will call you if there's something going on and they're covering public lands, wilderness issues, trails. Reporters will call you, and so call them back, return their calls promptly. And before you do that, prepare your talking points. Try to stick to your script. What's most important about your issue that you want the public to understand? But please don't be afraid to call them back because you're being invited into a conversation. Ways to engage reporters beforehand: you can invite them to your events. You can bring them out on your trails. You can bring them out to your wilderness areas. You can invite them to your meetings, your public meetings. Find out who covers your issues, and even go as far as calling that person and just set up a meet and greet where you sit down and talk about things and figure out what they're interested in writing about. They may become a long-term ally for your cause because they might hold, you know, the same feelings as you, and they'll do stories about the things you care about, and that can come back to a member of Congress who's thinking, well, what are my constituents reading about? What are they thinking about? If there's a news story that you were part of, somebody in your community can write an opinion piece that would get in the paper, and you see how the circle can spread. So it's I'm going to end it there, but it's a really powerful way to get the debate rolling, is to get it out in the public on someone else's platform. So, and I'll be around for questions.
All right. I probably shouldn't have stopped sharing right there. So our next speaker up is John Pomeroy, who is an attorney working in Washington, D.C. John's been a registered lobbyist, or still is, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about the question that is on everybody's mind: is what constitutes lobbying? How much can we do, not do, with lobbying as a stewardship organization? So John, I'm going to turn the time over to you, and
okay, great.
And then you can share your screen now, John.
There we go. Bingo. Great, everybody should see that. Thanks, Randy, and it's great to talk with everybody. I'm going to talk about the boring legal stuff. I promise not to make it too boring. All of your organizations are tax exempt under Section 501c3, the status that lets people give you donations that are deductible and all of that good stuff. And the one thing I want you to leave here with is I want you to be able to speak up when somebody tells you, oh my God, we're a charity, we're a C3, we can't lobby. That's wrong. And you're going to be able to tell them why they're wrong. Because not only can 501c3s lobby, but they can do all sorts of other advocacy that isn't lobbying. And frankly, you're a really effective voice for wilderness because you don't have an agenda other than protecting the wilderness areas that you work in. So let me talk about the tax rules for 501c3. As I said, 501c3s are allowed to lobby, but the amount of lobbying you can do is limited. We're going to talk about what those limits are. Contrast that to other types of tax exempt organizations. Some organizations are not C3s, but are some other kind of tax exempt organization, like 501c4, which can do an unlimited amount of lobbying. And there are some things that C3s have really tough restrictions on. You are not allowed to do anything that looks like it's trying to get somebody elected. Supporting or opposing candidates for public office is something that C3s have to stay away from. Now, I want to distinguish that from being aware of the fact that the people you're talking to in Congress care a lot about elections. As you've already heard, you need to think when you're doing your advocacy work about why these people are going to listen to you. And one of the reasons that they're going to care is they think it's going to help them win the next election, or at least not hurt them as they try and win the next election. So when I say that you're not allowed to support or oppose electoral candidates, I mean, at come election time, you can't say, oh, our member of Congress is terrific and the person that she's running against is just awful on wilderness issues. Don't do that. But you can go into these meetings with your members and their staff and say, you know, it turns out we've done some polling in your district and 70 or 80% think that naming this new area as a wilderness area or supporting more trails work to make the use better for the people who live around here or helping the tourism, that's great to be able to tell them that the people they're trying to come to for votes care a lot about the issue. Watch out for rules other than these tax rules that we're going to talk about. I know that a lot of you get some money from agencies or you may get foundation grants. Some of those come with restrictions on using that particular money for lobbying activity. But honestly, you can raise a little bit of extra money to do lobbying with other money and not run afoul of those rules. In fact, if you're doing it, as most of you are, with mostly volunteers doing your advocacy work, it's not going to cost you any money at all, so there's not going to be a problem. Okay, if you do lobby under the rules we're talking about, you are required to report it to the IRS every year on your organization's tax return. Ask your accountant. It's on Schedule C of that Form 990 that you file every year. So now I want to talk about the nitty-gritty of these tax rules. And they're actually not one set of rules, but two. Charities, 501c3 organizations like yours, are either going to have to measure how much lobbying they do and live within the limits under the so-called no substantial part test, or under something that is called the 501h expenditure test. Now, the no substantial part test is, I guess, easy is the right word, because what that rule says is that your charity is allowed to lobby so long as you don't do a substantial amount of it. The problem with that rule is that we don't actually know what substantial is, and we don't know what lobbying is under that test. It's kind of a sort of, if it feels like you're doing a lot of stuff that kind of looks like lobbying, the IRS might get mad at you. So instead of that, I think most of your organizations are going to want to operate under the far more clear 501h expenditure test. That's going to require that you tell the IRS that you want to do that. There's a form to fill out. You only have to do it once to elect the 501h expenditure test. But if you do it, then instead of this sort of vague no substantial part test, you actually get the 501h test, which offers two advantages. One is you know exactly how much lobbying you're allowed to do because it's measured by how much money you spend on it. Now you can figure out how much lobbying you can do by doing the math. For most of you, I don't know many organizations that have budgets of more than $500,000. So I'm guessing that most of you can spend 20% of your money on lobbying. That's amazing. That's a lot of money. There are two different limits baked into that. You can spend all of that money on what's called direct lobbying, or you can spend a quarter of it, 25% of your overall limit, on what's called grassroots lobbying. And we'll talk about those differences in a second. If you get really big, I should tell you that there's a cap of organizations operating under this can't spend more than $1 million a year on lobbying. If you get that big, call me and you can hire me. It'll be great. So let me talk about what the definitions of lobbying are. And you actually kind of already know this, right? I mean, when I say direct lobbying and grassroots lobbying, direct lobbying is when you go to your member's office, either the district office or the office in Washington, and you knock on the door and you talk to the staffer or you talk to the member and you say, hey, I'd really like you to support this appropriations line for the trails program that I care about. You're communicating directly with that member of Congress's office about a specific legislative proposal. If you're doing grassroots lobbying, well, that's when you put out messages to the public and you say, hey, there's a proposal to make this area a new wilderness area, or to designate this area as a wild and scenic river, or some other thing that you may care about. And you tell people, contact your member of Congress and let them know that you favor this. That's grassroots lobbying, where instead of talking to the lawmakers yourself, you're talking to the public and asking them to speak up about the issue you care about. Now, I want to focus on a couple of specific points within that larger definition. But before I do, understand what the thing we're doing here is. Because you're a 501c3 that can only do a limited amount of lobbying, your goal is to try and take only the parts of your advocacy that need to be lobbying and count it as lobbying. To the degree that you know enough about these definitions or some of the exceptions you can talk about, to take your advocacy out of that definition so that it doesn't count against your limits, well, you can do more advocacy without burning up your lobbying limits. So let me show you the first way that I know to move advocacy out of that limited lobbying box. One way is to know exactly when you're talking about legislation, because if you're not talking about legislation or a specific legislative proposal, you're not lobbying. So yes, when you're talking about a bill, even a budget or an appropriations bill, or even proposed legislation that hasn't been introduced, or some specific legislative policy proposal that you want Congress to enact, that's going to be a specific legislative proposal. But there's a bunch of things that aren't going to be a legislative proposal. I'm just going to mention before I talk about those that ballot measures are special. Some of you live in states where your state may allow the people to vote at election time on whether or not something should be part of your constitution or whether a bond measure should be passed or something like that. The IRS treats that as lobbying too, but if you ever get involved in something like that, you're going to have to worry about your state campaign finance laws as well, because they're going to regulate that. But let me go back to all the stuff that isn't legislation. There's a lot of the things that you as wilderness groups care about going to be not legislation, and when you advocate on them, it's not going to count against your C3 lobbying rights. In particular, if you want the agency to decide something that they have the power to decide without congressional action, or set administrative rules to implement some law that's already passed, it's not going to burn up your lobbying. So again, the game here is to figure out how much stuff you can do that doesn't have to count against your limits. The other key point that I want to talk about is when you're doing grassroots lobbying, and let me go back to that slide so you can remember where we're talking about. Remember that grassroots lobbying, just like direct lobbying, is communicating your views on a specific legislative proposal. But instead of talking to members of Congress, you're talking to the general public. And it requires that there be a call to action. And that's what I want to talk about next. If you don't have a call to action, it's not going to be grassroots lobbying. Now, a call to action is that part of the thing when you're talking to the public that says, hey, call your legislator, or here's the phone number or the link to the website where you can send a message to your member of Congress. Or even just identifying somebody who is undecided and that maybe you should spend a lot of effort to try and get them to decide your way on a legislative proposal. But if you leave that stuff out, well, you can be an effective advocate and it won't count against your lobbying limits. And the best example of that is something you've already heard about, which is talking to the media. You can talk about very specific legislation. You can talk about what your organization's views are on that legislation. You can urge that Congress enact the legislative proposal that you want them to enact. You can even say that you're trying to lobby very hard to enact this legislation or prevent it from happening yourself. And it won't be lobbying, because almost never do you tell a reporter, hey, I want everybody who reads your article to call their member of Congress. That's not what you talk to reporters about. You tell people that, but you don't tell reporters that. It still gets your message out, but it's not lobbying. There are also a bunch of lobbying exceptions you can use. If you do a big report, what's a so-called nonpartisan analysis, study, or research that really lays out sort of the pros and cons of the issue, even if you come to a conclusion and you say, and this is the right answer, and this is why we're supporting that legislation, put that out on your website, distribute it to members of Congress, give it to the media. If you leave off a call to action there, it's not going to be lobbying. And indeed, you can print it out, and when you meet with members of Congress, you can leave a copy of it with them. None of the cost of producing that report counts as lobbying. If you get a request to help Congress in writing from a government body, like a legislative committee, it's not lobbying because they asked you to help. And the most common way to not count something as lobbying is if you try to get an invitation to go testify at a hearing, get it in writing from the committee, and it's not going to count as lobbying because it's a request for technical assistance. There's a couple of other exceptions that aren't as relevant to what you're doing. I can talk about them during the Q&A if you care, but those first two are big exceptions for you. And then the last thing I want to mention is that these tax rules that we've talked about here right now are one of the sets of rules that measure what lobbying is and how much of it you can do. In fact, it's the only set of rules that measure how much you can do. But you do also have to be aware of lobbying disclosure laws. I don't want to spend too much time on this because most of you, this isn't going to matter to, but at the federal level, and I think almost every state, if not every state, and even some local jurisdictions, there are so-called lobbying disclosure laws where people who do some certain amount of lobbying in that state have to register as a lobbyist or an organization that employs lobbyists and report their activities. None of these laws restrict how much you can do. And in fact, they apply, these lobbying disclosure laws apply to everybody, not just nonprofits. And just to confuse things, their definition of what is or is not lobbying differs from the definitions we just talked about for the tax rules. For example, sometimes when you are trying to influence administrative agency action, those do count as lobbying for the purposes of these disclosure rules. The reason I'm not spending much time on this is that almost all of them have a threshold of activity that is probably too high for your organization to have to register and report as a lobbyist under these laws. For example, it's, I forget what the current limit is, honestly, because it's indexed, but it's, you have to spend some tens of thousands of dollars a year lobbying to be having to register and report under the Federal Lobbying Disclosure Act. If you're doing a lot of state or local advocacy, it's not a bad idea to do a quick check and make sure you're not doing so much that you have an obligation under that law. But mostly what you're going to care about are the tax rules that we talked about when it comes to C3s and how much lobbying they can do. That was a really quick spin through this, so I'm going to stick around and answer questions if people have some.
All right. All right, thank you, John. So I think we are getting to that point. Yep, we're at the point where we're going to take another poll question here. Just one second. So now that you guys have had a chance to hear from our expert speakers about talking with agencies, talking with congressionals, and the rules on lobbying, what's your comfort level for doing personal stewardship advocacy? Go ahead and just take a moment and respond to the poll. All right, not everybody's participating. Come on now, join in. Tell us what you're thinking. Have we helped? Have we helped you feel more comfortable? Is still feeling a little uncomfortable? We're going to have a chance in a few minutes to ask questions and have some discussion with our experts. So I think general, we're going to share the results with everybody. Generally, people are feeling pretty comfortable, either somewhat or very comfortable. It's good to know that nobody's feeling uncomfortable about meeting with congressionals or agency staff. So that's a good thing. So let's go back to the last little piece here. So our schedule of webinars, we're going to continue our stewardship advocacy series. Next webinar is September 20th. And then in October, we're going to have the Ask workshop, where we'll be dealing with identifying specific activities, specific things we want to request from our congressional representatives. And then just before the workshop in November, we were going to do a pre-trip information webinar. We're still determining what we're going to do with that one. But as you probably heard, our in-person National Wilderness Workshop has been deferred because of the increase in COVID cases around the country. And instead, we're converting the National Wilderness Workshop to a virtual workshop. That'll happen during the week of November 15th through the 19th. And as part of that, we had planned the Washington, D.C. advocacy trip. Unfortunately, we're going to make it virtual as well. We're working out the details, but we're going to try to provide the same similar sort of opportunities to meet with congressional staffers and even committee staff and agency leadership, similar to what we would have done with an in-person meeting. So stay tuned for those details, and that will all be part of the National Wilderness Workshop agenda. And as we move forward, we want to also remind you about the ask. We've talked about the ask a number of times. Our October workshop will be really focused in on what are the specific things the wilderness community wants to ask of Congress and the agencies. And as you think about it, we want you to continue to think through what it is that's important to you as a wilderness stewardship organization, and what would you like to see Congress make changes in. Is it additional money for stewardship? Is it legislation to add more wilderness areas? Is it legislation to fix issues in your particular area? Or to amend how the agencies work? Do we need agency rule changes? These are the things that we need you to help us feed up and collect, so that we can have a fairly strong list of things that we would like to discuss with the agency and congressional members come November. We want it to come from you, the grassroots, and work its way up so that it's something that the whole community can agree upon. And that's where our strength will be in making that ask. And so we'll have some more on that in the next workshop, and then in October, we'll dig deep and produce a common, consistent set of asks that we would like everybody then to work on, creating talking points and other materials that will be used as part of the ask. So we're at that point where if there are questions, go ahead and please share them in the chat or raise your hand. We'll recognize you, give you a chance to ask any of our presenters your specific question. But go ahead first with the chat, and then we'll see where we end up. So, Andrew, could you also help me queue these up?
Yeah, happy to.
All right. So I'm looking through. So Mike asked early on, would it be appropriate for an advocacy group lobbying a member of Congress for a wilderness bill to give an early heads up to a legislative affairs staff after informing the line officers. I think, Joe, you did respond to that earlier, but you want to elaborate on that?
Sure. Thank you, Randy. And Mike, thanks for the question. You know, as I wrote in my response, you know, we usually get those heads up, or when I was working there, we got those heads up from our regional legislative affairs folks and so forth. But working through them, you might ask, who is the legislative affairs specialist that will be handling the testimony and managing that testimony? And you may want to get their phone number and email. And then likewise, there was always some questions that, you know, for context and perspective in trying to present to the Congress, whether the House or the Senate, to get various people's views on the legislation. So it may be beneficial to have that, so that the legislative affairs specialist could reach out and ask some clarifying questions and determine how to write the testimony that reflects reflects your view, to get, you know, the best thing, which is support for that legislation.
Hey, and Joe, we had another question too about legislative maps. And I know that legislative maps come in all shapes and sizes. Some are produced by the advocacy groups, some are produced by congressional committees themselves, some are produced by the agency at the request of Congress. Could you just speak real briefly about the accuracy of those maps, how they come about, and when they get the stamp of official approval?
Yeah, legislative maps, that's a dicey one, right? Because Randy's totally correct. They can come from all over the place. But I think my recommendation, okay, and my recommendation to folks at the Hill is to work with the Forest Service and the regional wilderness folks and their GIS specialists, because the Forest Service has all of the layers that would go into a legislative map. So the vegetation layer, the water system layer, the minerals and geology, which can and the leases, which can be problematic. Old roads, there's numbers and numbers of things, and so I do recommend, like, even if you're working with your local member and the local staff, is to engage the Forest Service early for wilderness maps. Now, the thing about a wilderness map, it's made a legislative map. It's made for the member, okay, who is the sponsor of the bill. So it's not a public document and should not be shared. Legislative affairs would not share that with others. And only time it becomes public is when the House or the Senate post it on their website. But other than that, because you all advocates for this particular piece of legislation, we keep it confidential. The agency won't release it. You shouldn't release it, and so forth. So that, and then same thing with the testimony. Anything that when you talk to a legislative affairs specialist and tell them information about the bill and that's in testimony, that testimony is not shared. That's kept confidential until it reaches the Hill and the committee. And then it's posted on the committee website. That's when that's public testimony. The same thing, and usually the map is at the same time, because you really can't do testimony without referring to the legislative map and saying, in this particular area, this is an outstanding, remarkable value that we think is worthy of designation in the wilderness preservation system. So so a little bit on legislative maps, and then you know, over my years, I had good friends that were surveyors, and They scratched their heads as best they could to try and figure out where the boundaries were for a particular wildernesses. Now we've gotten a little bit smarter about that, and we use elevational or contour lines or specific geologic or geographic reference points where the lines can be drawn and so forth, so that it makes it easier for the posting. And you have all seen this, and we have a gentleman here at the Brush Mountain East Texas Wilderness sign in the Jefferson National Forest, standing right there, either in the wilderness or just adjacent to the wilderness. And so the surveyors put up those signs, and they take that legislative map very seriously and work to put the boundary where it's supposed to be by the legislation. So clarity from the advocates, it would be really important to help the Forest Service. And then you may be involved in that and you're going, geez, I wish I was a little more specific, because a lot of volunteers help post those signs too.
All right, thanks, Joe. So I'm not seeing any other questions from our audience, so I'm going to give our presenters one last moment if they have any final comments that they would like to make. Andrew, we'll start with you. Any final thoughts?
Just view all these, all this work, lobbying, advocacy, as long-term relationship building. I think that's the goal everybody should have going into it, not any particular appropriation, but really a desire for your organization to have a long-term relationship with the offices that can affect your mission.
All right, Sue, any last thoughts? Oh, you're muted, Sue.
There, I got it. Well, I'll just say that I thought that the, just to build on what Andrew said, the theme of building relationships with people was consistent across all of the groups that you, of course, you want to work with. And so I heard things from Anders and Andrew that I would say the same about trying to work with agency staff. And certainly Bill did a great job of describing that very, very well. So I think you got some really great information here today. Thank you.
John, any final thoughts?
In some ways, what I had to talk about was the thing you should care about least. You are allowed to do this stuff. It's not very complicated. People can help you jump through the legal hoops, but remember just how powerful and important you are in making policy in this area, and building those relationships so that you can have an ongoing role, an ongoing seat at the table is just so important.
All right, Mark?
I have nothing to add really, other than if anybody needs help dealing with the media or anything else, I'm going to put my email in the chat, and I'll put my phone number. Don't share it, but please feel free to give me a call, and I'll try to talk you through anything you need. So thanks for inviting me.
You bet. Joe, any final thoughts before we close out?
Yeah, I'll just thank you, Randy, and thanks everybody for participating in this great webinar. I would let everybody know, and I wrote in the chat, that you can submit, even if you're not called as a witness, you can submit your own testimony on your own bill or your colleague's bill from another state or another part of your state as support. And that usually is the day of the hearing, for maybe about a week after the hearing is when the record closes. And if you are invited to testify, try to summarize your testimony by making eye contact with the members. And remember, they'll be in a huge semicircle. They'll around you. You'll be at a table. You speak clearly into the microphone. Make that eye contact, and do not read your testimony. They've already read it. The staff's already read it to them. All of that kind of stuff. Tell them your quick elevator speech that you want them to know about this bill and about this particular piece of land that you want to add to the wilderness preservation system. And then you'll be grilled by different members, starting with the majority and maybe the chairman, and then the minority and so forth. And it goes back and forth. And you could be at the witness table for maybe about an hour and 15 minutes, something like that. About that time, though, people get hungry, and then they start to leave. But whatever you do, if you don't know the answer, tell them I don't know. Be frank about it and say I will get back to you. It's an opportunity to continue the dialogue, and go and do the research that's needed to give them the answer that they are seeking.
All right, thanks, Joe, for that words of wisdom, and very, very important one. Well, everybody, I think we've covered. Our other presenters have had to leave and go on to other things that they're doing. I know that you guys all have other things that you need to do too, so we're going to go ahead and close this presentation of the NWSA Wilderness Stewardship webinars for today. Our next webinar will be September 20th, where we will do Wilderness Stewardship 201, dive into some more details on specific legislative issues, and continuing that relationship with our congressional membership. So thanks, everybody. We're glad you could join us. We appreciate you all, and thanks for all the wilderness stewardship work that you're doing. Bye now.
Thanks, everyone.